we've knocked on doors, we've done telephone polling, all of these different methods, and nothing satisfied the powers that be. They wanted to be able to get large amounts of public commentary, but they wanted the assurance that it was within the 9 individual neighborhood units that we had identified along the rail corridor, which runs for about 10 miles. So the question then became, how can we consult with people online geospatially? And I did a bunch of research and came up empty-handed. I could not find a solution that would meet all of the criteria that we'd established in our requirements gathering process. So that being the case, I started to analyze it and figure out, well, on the one hand, what do we need to do to connect people to place online in a provable way? Because ultimately, what we're talking about here is being able to use public feedback as evidence to inform decision-making or public policy development. So you've got to think of that consultation data as the evidence that you need, in this case, to inform the decisions that we're going to come out of it. So we need to connect people to place in an authenticated way, but we also need to protect individual privacy. So that's on the one hand of the individual. And on the other hand, we need to be able to gather feedback from them in a variety of forms: polls, surveys, discussions. You know, we have a whole laundry list of different ways that we gather feedback from the public. So that was what happened. You know, it was really trying to solve a specific problem that then led me to understand the implications of it in a larger context. Because what we learned over time was that all of those green dots that you can see on the map, which are geo-authenticated people, once we've established where they live, then the opportunity was created to go back to them, to keep them informed and engaged on an ongoing basis. So what started as location-based citizen engagement is actually emerging into civic networking, which is an interesting observation. So that's how it started. It started, again, in 2010, I was working on the Arbutus Corridor project. In 2011, the city said, if you build what you're talking about, we'll test it. I got the National Research Council of Canada on board for technology validation, got together some graduate and undergraduate students, and over the summer of 2011, ran a series of pilots based on a prototype, which is very rudimentary, but proved out the thesis. And ever since then, we're now into our 7th year of support from the National Research Council as we've continued to elaborate on the core technology. And this is all, again, this started as a research project. It didn't start as us, you know, intending to go out and be a civic tech startup, although that's where we've ended up. I point out this slide because in Government Technology magazine, which covers solutions for state and local governments in the United States, but also in Canada, in their year-end retrospective in December, they included PlaceSpeak with these little headlines up above, identifying the importance of what we are doing, which is making the interaction online painless, which is accurate. But the reason that it's painless is because of the authentication. We're eliminating trolls and bots and other online dysfunction. We know we're reaching real people within relevant geographical boundaries in a legitimate way. And after, you know, with what's been going on with troll farms and bots and astroturfing, all these things have really come to underscore the importance of building trust in the online process, which I don't know if anybody saw or knows about the Edelman Trust Barometer, but it was just published in the last couple of weeks and noted in the United States in particular that trust in public institutions had dropped, I can't remember if it was 32 or 36 points, but the largest single drop in the history of the Trust Barometer, which of course you guys will have a pretty good idea why that's been happening. But this was, again, as we started out, the core value, what we were trying to do was to answer this problem. How do we engage within geographical boundaries in a provable way? But this then sent me into some deeper analysis. So I ended up actually re-enrolling it in grad school at the University of British Columbia here in the Interdisciplinary Studies graduate program, where I've been working on my PhD in applied innovation. And part of that, even though I started in geography, which is my home department, was in political science. And I did a graduate seminar with Mark Warren, who you may know, Beth, in democratic theory. And I used that as an opportunity to examine the and develop a framework around digital democratic best practices. What are the essential elements that must be in place in order to establish legitimacy in your process? And popular control, which suggests that we elect representatives to represent us, so they need to know what us think, which is why we're collecting public feedback data in the first place, that needs to be made real. We need to know that they're real citizens within boundaries, so that that feedback that's received can be used legitimately in policy or decision making. In order to be legitimate, people need to be informed and educated about the subject that is under discussion. Again, consider judgment being an essential element, as it were, to promote informed dialogue, reasonableness, and civil discourse. Inclusiveness or inclusivity. When I first started this, there was still argument about the digital divide. I'm in Canada, and our long-form census results that came out in the last couple of years have shown that the vast majority of Canadians are online or have some kind of access to the internet through their mobile device or whatever. So if we want to reach the largest number of people, notwithstanding that we continue to do our established practices, that we've got to be doing it online. But again, we've got to be doing it online in a real way. And that's where the notion of transferability comes in. When we vote, and similarly, when we provide our public feedback towards decision making, we need to know that you're a real person and you are legitimately able to vote or express your feedback within jurisdictional boundaries. And so this is where I started to think a lot about digital identity authentication and the you can't have authentication without privacy. And I was introduced to the notion of privacy by design, which is at the heart of how PlaceSpeak has been constructed. Transparency, obviously, all the movement towards open data, open government speaks to this. Seeing is believing. If we want to establish public trust, transparency is an essential element of it. And then efficiency. However we're managing that public process has got to be efficient in time and money. So this is the larger thinking that has gone on behind the way that PlaceSpeak has been architected. And it does come back to the implementation of these core concepts. We consult with people, we collect evidence to inform our deliberation and influence outcomes, or that's the way it's supposed to work. But our research showed early on that the vast majority of people believed that the decisions were foregone conclusions, and the consultation process was really just a marketing exercise. And the way that marketing techniques, market research are being used in public practice, to me, reinforces that. And you can understand the underlying cynicism. So just quickly, we know the problems with our existing methodology. You can read the fine print. We usually get a bit of a giggle out of that one. But people feel the pain of traditional methods of public consultation. But we know that online, because of anonymity, because people think that they're not culpable, it has been overrun with trolls, bots, astroturfing, and new methods of manipulation that the likes of Cambridge Analytica are coming up with that, that further erode the public trust. I also point out that if all we're doing is gathering feedback into a black box, it lacks sufficient transparency. to be authentic, which brings me to why we've been developing this or elaborating on the concept of the importance of digital identity authentication in citizen engagement. And again, if you're trying to make data actionable, you have to be able to stand behind the quality of the data. I would point you to what you probably looked at with the FCC online consultation around net neutrality and the bots and the dead people. That's a perfect illustration of how online public consultation gone awry. That would not have happened if there had been the requirement for authentication, coupled with the requirement for protection of individual privacy. And the way that PlaceSpeak deals with this, and this comes to the question around the two-sided market, is by disaggregating the digital identity authentication piece from the feedback that people provide. So you know they're real people, you know they're within jurisdiction or whatever relevant boundaries, but you never have to touch the private information that the individual uses to verify themselves. Jump in any time if you want to, or you can send me questions. So the model then, when you think about it, becomes, once you've established an authenticated people to place, the model then becomes citizen-centered. As I mentioned before, it's now, you now have the opportunity to be able to go back to people to keep them informed based on their location and engage them in future consultations according to their preferences. And so this model that we've been developing has been covered, and I'll share this deck with you. It's an update on ones that I've done previously, but it's got hyperlinks to various sources throughout, as well as reference material. So this was your second question about the two-sided market. Yes, it is between participants and proponent organizations, because it's we call them proponents, or we were calling them proponents, but people glazed over, so I've just been calling them organizations. But the core thing is here that PlaceSpeak is acting as an intermediary, and you must have an intermediary if you want to break down the silos. Silos cannot break down silos by definition. So in a citizen-centered model, it shouldn't matter whether it's local government, regional government, state, provincial, federal government, school districts, transportation authorities, whatever the public sector organization is that needs to consult. By using the citizen-centered model, they are able to go back to the people that reside within the relevant areas in a repeatable way. So the individual, if you've signed up, you sign up, you create a profile, you choose your settings, which I'll elaborate on in a minute. And then organizations create consultation topics. We call them topics, not issues, because the word issue is too value laden from our testing. And then there's really 5 key points in setting up a consultation. Well, setting it up and determining who's on your team, mapping out and determining the scope of who can participate, uploading all your content to inform and educate people, then choosing from a range of features to gather feedback, and then 5th and finally, report on it. And I emphasize, as you'll see, as much transparency in the reporting process to, again, build confidence in the process. So if you've signed up, we've been refining and trying to simplify the sign-up process, while at the same time ensuring that there's sufficient legitimacy. And so the way it works on the two sides is that you can choose to add additional layers of authentication, and we're adding more in different ways, and also working on a blockchain approach as well, so that people can choose how many levels of authentication. You become more influential the more authenticated you are. And then on the other side, the organization can determine how many levels of verification they require, because some consultations might be more controversial than others, where you really need to depend on the veracity of the data. So this is where the whole notion of a digital identity authentication or ecosystem comes in. And we're involved with the DIAC in Canada, which is the Digital Identity Authentication Council. But there's the Cantera initiative, there's work that's going on with NIST, There's an international community that are all working around digital identity, and have of course identified this as an essential element in the long term as we look at the maturity of public processes online. So I probably don't need to go through all of this other than to say that we are elaborating on your personal profile. Initially, only you could see it. We're now going to make it so that you can share your profile and interact more on a civic networking basis with your neighbors. And we've introduced neighborhoods, and we're going to be doing this in a more comprehensive way, again, so that people within close-knit boundaries can talk amongst themselves. You can control in your settings your verification levels, your privacy levels, because you can choose to be publicly anonymous, even though you will have been verified for the purposes of the consultation. You can add multiple places, so you can add your office or your university, and notifications can be chosen by frequency, distance, and keyword. And again, this is something that we expect to elaborate on. Is people, what we're seeing is people might want to hear about housing or land use change within a mile of their home, but they may want to know about transportation within 10 miles. So if there's one thing that I can communicate around this, is that this has been very much an emergent process where we roughed it in the beginning and then have continued to elaborate on it. With the idea ultimately being is that we want this to be a place where people go to keep informed about what's going on in their areas that are relevant to them, and provide a standardized mechanism for them to be providing feedback accordingly. And your geolocation is important, because just imagine where you live. And I think I have, yeah, this slide here's me down here. If you do a 360 and you think about all of the different things that are going on around where you live, it might be the city, it might be land use change, which is where I started, things like rezonings and development permit applications, or it might be road closures, or it could be school closures, parking changes. All of these different things are revolving around you in a citizen-centered model. And what we're trying to do is to leverage the network effect to create greater community engagement. Part of this, one of the things we realized early on is that we started off with individual consultation topics, and you get people on board, they become a green dot, and then you lose them. So we started to think about what were the ways that we could keep people engaged on an ongoing basis. And that started with keeping people informed. And right now we inform people badly. We put up signs, we put an ad in the newspaper, we put a flyer in the mail, and people are constantly complaining that they weren't informed. So we started, again, as another National Research Council project, to look at ways that we could begin to automate place-based notifications. And again, it's like the saying that all politics are local. This is the same thing, same basic principles. So we developed a system where we could start automating notifications based on land use change, because our research showed us that those were the most in-demand data sets. But we've now started to develop a broader context, so that at say it's a state level, you would be able to notify people and draw a polygon around a whole state and let people know what's going on in a sort of broader concept. And we've been working on that with the BC provincial government here. But we are seeing a lot of movement in the open data space. What we're trying to do is to get the data that keeps people informed geospatially on the list of data priorities, especially within local governments. And then we introduce neighborhoods, which is like Nextdoor, which many of you will be familiar with in some respects, in that people verify themselves within neighborhood boundaries and then are able to message one another and post things on the notice board and the events calendar. And again, we've roughed this in. We are going to continue to elaborate on it as we elaborate on the participant side of the two-sided model. But it's been an interesting challenge, and this I'm going to bring it, just zoom down here. This is actually just illustrating the points that there's a lot of different applications of this approach and this technology. Once you've got people geolocated, maybe they sign up for a school consultation, then they're there to be notified about transportation or property development or talking to their elected officials. So this tells us both that there's a wide variety of applications, but also that they cross-pollinate. But I want to jump into your question about the financial aspect of this. This was tricky. When I very first started, of course, I had no idea how we were going to monetize this thing. And I wasn't even thinking about it, frankly. And I looked at first about, could we set it up as a nonprofit? But nonprofits won't scale, frankly. And you, outside of an individual funder, you can't raise any money. And developing technology, if you're actually developing new technology, is expensive, and you have to pay software engineers to do it. So I was able to, well, first of all, get a fair amount of R&D grants, which I've got good support on the build side, but then you need people to buy it. And I don't come from a sales and marketing background. I'm a planner and an academic, and I've moved into becoming a business person because I've had to, not because that's what my background or interest was in. But if we want to build something that's sustainable, we had to find a financial model that would work. So I looked at the other companies that were selling software to local governments. They were doing it on, an individual project basis, or they were doing it in a broader context, but they were doing it in large dollar amounts. And that defeated the purpose as far as I was concerned, because if you want people to consult, you want to try and keep the price point as low as possible to promote engagement. So we settled on a software as a service model, which you can see in front of you, so that organizations can go, they can set up their topic, they can do it all themselves and pay on their credit card monthly or annually with a discount. The standard was the do-it-yourself model. The premium was the full suite of tools plus help setting up and more frequent customer support. And then what we started to see over time is that they come to us and they say, well, we got an organization, we want to do them all this way. And so we're still feeling our way through this, but we've been developing enterprise level. And indeed, what we've started to see, even our multiple levels of government, like regional districts or counties and local governments. So for example, the Cowichan Valley Regional District, which contains 4 different municipalities, is using it at the regional level, and the 4 different municipalities and the school district, all within the same geography. So they're all using it for different reasons. They're all paying for it separately, but it started with an initiative by the regional district. And this has been really important because it's proved out the thesis of the citizen-centered model and the network effect that works when you've got a lot of activity going on within an area. I don't know if anybody's read it, but there was a Knight Foundation report that was published late last year on scaling civic tech. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you have a look at it, because it's been a real eye-opener to people like me that have become civic tech entrepreneurs. Is that it's in the United States, foundations have supported the development of a lot of the civic tech, but then they have had a hard time translating that into sales in the way that technology and tech startups normally work. Companies like Nextdoor have been able to raise over $200 million because they've characterized their activities as social networking, which is something that resonates with the venture capital tech funding world. Whereas people that are taking a social venture approach like us, are less attractive to venture capitalists because our motivation is not pure profit. Our motivation is trying to, you know, not save the world. I know that sounds really hokey, but trying to do positive things that are going to have a positive effect socially and politically. So we continue. I've been able to raise about $1.5 million of friends and family and angel seed capital. We've worked towards getting to break even on a run rate basis to you know, be able to survive and grow. But we will get to a point where what we're seeing in the civic tech world, if you're observing this yourselves, is there's a lot of M&A, mergers and acquisitions activity going on. We just saw Granicus buy VisionNet. We just saw OpenGov buy Peak Democracy, for example. So I think this speaks to a lot of the financial challenges that are going on in the civic tech world, which you may find interesting to look at in more detail. Your question about, as stakeholders go, how do how does PlaceSpeak tend to allow partner organizations? This is totally partner organization oriented. You go on, you go up to start a consultation, and you guys can do this and play in the sandbox without any cost and familiarize yourself with the tools. But you create an organization. Once an organization is in there, you can have multiple managers and you can create all different topics. And as I mentioned, some organizations are going enterprise, like the City of Yellowknife here, so they do unlimited topics. Other ones add them incrementally and you know, put them on their credit cards and archive them once they're done. The key elements, again, are setup, map it out, upload your content, choose from your toolkit, and report on it. And there's a bunch of PR and communications tools that are built in as well. Now, at this point, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that we have gone through a process starting last summer where, we brought a bunch of students together and we went out to the existing customer base and did a bunch of usability testing, asked what they liked or didn't like about the platform. And we've gone through a major redesign, which is now done and is in testing, is going to come out any day now once the testing is completed. But instead of the interface that I was just showing you on the slides, we're going to see something like this that is a lot, you know, lot sexier and responds to the questions that we were asking of users. So people will set it up, it'll walk them through their content upload, their feature selection, their promotions, and all of those things. And so this is going to come out really soon, like maybe next week if we're lucky. So in the meantime, you can go in and play with all this, all the tools if you want to. There's a button that would be there that would say upgrade, which would be what would take you through the payment portal. So you'd have to put it on your credit card, but you only have to do that if you want to publish it and make it go public. So we did this deliberately because we wanted to create familiarity and try and show, especially the kind of communications people that we run into predominantly in local government, not to be afraid of it, that it's actually a really easy interface. But again, the key elements are determining who can participate, and this is important. Hopefully you've got that from my talk thus far, is it is important to know that the people are within relevant boundaries. You can still collect feedback from people that are outside of the area that you're studying, but they're going to be labeled as non-resident. You can make it so that you can do private stakeholder consultations and only people on a list or database can participate. We've seen this in certain instances. And you can also determine how many levels of verification are required for people to participate. Most of the time you don't want to add any additional rigor because any kind of friction is going to reduce the number of participants. But you do have that capability. You can upload, as I mentioned, lists. We see things like school districts uploading their lists of all their PAC lists, which are their parent advisory councils, and then tracking whether people have connected or not. and you can remind them without spamming them. The map is the most important, the map is the key differentiating feature. So in this example, the city of New Westminster geofenced and said only people within our boundaries can participate. But internally, these different colored polygons are neighborhoods. So when they get to their reporting, whether they're using discussions or polls or surveys, whatever the tools are that they're using to gather the feedback, when you get to your reporting, all of the data is spatially segmented according to the polygons on the map, which is hugely relevant. This particular consultation was around a transportation plan and the plan to replace this bridge here, the Patella Bridge across the river. And obviously that was going to have greater effect on people that were in the immediate vicinity. They wanted to be able to contextualize the feedback geospatially. And then on the public side, make it public, make it transparent, sufficiently transparent to build confidence in the process. And that's really been key. One example that I sent to you yesterday to have a look at was a recent consultation in Indiana, in Elkhart County, where they got a rezoning request from Core Civic, which was a for-profit prison company that wanted to build a 1,400 unit, however you define, 1,400 cell, whatever, detention center within the county. And the county commissioner's office was completely overrun with emails and responses, but they wanted to ensure that only residents could participate in the consultation. So the key takeaways were that they had, first of all, tremendous response. We saw 1,000 people sign up like on the first day. And I'm just going to have to sign in so I can show you a little bit more here. But the key takeaways were, one, to the point that I made earlier, they had 173 comments with 0 trolls. You could see who the people were and where they were coming from, unless they chose to be anonymous. But our research has shown that fewer than 5% of respondents choose to be anonymous given the opportunity. And the other key thing was that we have been working on being able to do real-time data visualization. And this one's from a poll. But last year, we developed something called a Sentimap for spatial visualization of big text data. So if you're doing, you get large amounts of qualitative data that you can also do color coding to give a sense of how people's opinions differ in different places. But I didn't realize it because I don't know Elkhart County. But this area, Goshen here, is a college town. And so the response rates were higher and it tended to be, as it was brought to my attention, more democratic territory. So the feedback, the overwhelming majority were, against this because of the goals of the community. Really, really interesting takeaway. And that this is going to be something that we continue to work on is this kind of spatial visualization and the ability to be gathering feedback that is actionable because of its defensibility and legitimacy. And the punchline of all of this, of course, was that within a week of them running this consultation, the for-profit prison company withdrew their request on the strength of the public feedback. And this wasn't just a bunch of ranting on Facebook. This was transparent and defensible in the eyes of the public, and making it real online, as I like to say. So, in my opinion, what makes PlaceSpeak effective is, here's a classic example of what makes it effective. Is we know that we're getting real defensible feedback within relevant jurisdictional boundaries that is being demonstrated in a transparent way, and everything goes back to that legitimacy framework that I showed you earlier in ticking the boxes. What are the current limitations of PlaceSpeak? Well, we have, we have limited resources. We've depended largely on R&D grants. We've worked largely with university students and coming from a more academic and scholarly background, rather than going out and trying to raise millions of dollars of venture capital. Again, I drew your attention to that Knight Foundation report on scaling civic tech, where it really did examine in a useful way the limitations of civic tech. We also see a lot of different jurisdictions deciding that they all want to build it themselves. They all want to. Tends to be an issue, and in my view, what it does is it just continues to reinforce the silos rather than breaking down the silos, which I personally think is really important. So what we are trying to do right now, what this year is all about, is getting to break even on a run rate basis, meaning that we're making enough money. But when you're only charging $250 or $500 a month per topic, it's got to scale to get to, where you say you need to make $50,000 a month to pay your team. Well, that's a lot of $250 or $500 a month. But we are starting to really see that. We've started to work through other channel partners of other technology companies and telecommunications companies. And we've also started to break down some of the other impediments with the senior levels of government. Paradoxically, we have, as I mentioned, we've received now going into 7 years of support through the National Research Council of Canada. So we've had really good support on the build side. Again, this was reinforced by that Knight Foundation report with foundations in the US. But what we haven't been able to do is to get them to start using it. We've now broken the logjam on that, and here's our first federal government of Canada consultation around the Ottawa River watershed. And this is also sparking some new stuff like, where is it? I'm covered up here so I can't see it, but we've got a webinar that they're putting on talking about their experience in using this platform. We had more hoops to jump through dealing with the federal government than you can imagine, or maybe you can imagine. But in Canada, we had the added complexity of having to make everything bilingual French. So, and not just any French, but Quebecois or Canadian French. So these are the kinds of lessons, again, that we have been learning as we've been going on about how to be working with the senior levels of government as well as with the hyper-local levels of government. So finally, just to finish your last question, was how has PlaceSpeak changed since you envisioned it? When I was thinking about it in the first place, I was trying to solve a problem, and that was how can I consult with people within these boundaries? And then how it has changed since I've envisioned it is I realized that once we've got all of those, once you start to get people verified, the opportunity is created to go back to them. And so in my Imagineering going forward, I'm really thinking more about civic networking, about how to make democracy habit forming in the same way that Facebook is habit forming or social media is habit forming, where people want to check in on a daily basis to find out what's going on in their area that's relevant to them. So in Canada, just recently, the federal government has put out a Smart Cities Challenge, and cities across the country are talking about that right now. And in fact, I'm speaking at a panel tonight at Simon Fraser University, which is featuring the CTOs from the city of Vancouver and the city of Surrey, which is the largest of the suburban municipalities in the region. Oh, and there's me. Talking about the future of this, not just through the standpoint of surveilling citizens, which is really what's going on in the thinking behind smart cities. It's how can we how can we be learning about people through their behavior, but rather how can we mesh that with genuine consultation? And to me, that's the biggest challenge. I don't know if anybody saw this article in the Atlantic regionally. It's stop saying smart cities. We have to be really mindful that we need to be able to gather feedback from people directly. That is their conscious contributions of feedback, not just surveilling people and making decisions from that, because I think that's going to be one of the largest challenges moving forward, and how we deal with public consultation and its role in the way in its role of advancing and strengthening our democracy. So that's it. Where I'm envisioning it, I want to see green dots all over the world. I want to see people genuinely interacting with government at all levels, or my simple way of putting it is changing the nature of the relationship between the public and the public sector online.
To find out more about how cities and states are using CrowdLaw, please visit thegovlab.org or check out crowd.law.